Surviving the Survivor. We bring you the best guests in all of true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button. Here's your host, Emmy Award-winning broadcaster, Joel Waldman.
What's up, STS Nation? Welcome to Surviving the Survivor. It is the show that brings you the very best guests in all of true crime on trending criminal cases. And this has been one that has been in the news since Sean Diddy Combs' two mega mansions were basically swarmed on the same day by FBI and Homeland Security investigation agents. And ever since then, this story has been making headlines each and every day. And in particular today, because both the government and the defense rested their cases in the trial involving Sean Diddy Combs versus the United States government. Sean Diddy Combs informing the judge that he will not take the stand. Let's go around the horn, introduce the best guests here. You've got Eric Faddis, a former felony prosecutor and current criminal defense and civil litigator out of the Mile High City. That would be Denver. And he is the founding partner of Varner Faddis Elite Legal and Eagle, and one of the best lawyer Instagrams that I've ever seen. So check it out. You will know what I'm talking about. We've got Megan Sachs, a full professor of criminology and the graduate program director at Fairleigh Dickinson University in the great state of New Jersey. She teaches classes including women in crime. There's no such thing as women and crime. It's they're separate from each other. But women in crime, serial killers, I guess Eileen Warnos, and crime policy. Amy, her co-worker, colleague, and her hosts two different podcasts, Women in Crime and Direct Appeal. And last but not least, Christy Greenberg, coming to us in a bit of a haze because of a last-minute tech issue that we'll resolve. It's no big deal. She sounds great. She's an MSNBC legal analyst, a former SDNY Criminal Division Deputy Chief. And that is important because this is all taking place at the SDNY in federal court in downtown Manhattan. She is a graduate of Harvard Law, and she's an MSNBC legal analyst now, as I said. So welcome to all of you. Christy, let me start with you. How is the government feeling with the defense resting and they having rested, and now it's in the hands of the jurors? What's going on in their minds?
Well, so not quite in the hands of the jurors yet. So tomorrow there's going to be a charge conference where the parties kind of hash out what the jurors are going to be told about the various charges and they're basically their instructions on the law. And then Thursday, we can expect closing arguments from both sides. Each side has said they need about 4 hours. So figure you're going to have the prosecutors and the defense go, prosecutors start in the morning, and after a lunch break, you'll get the defense. The judge has indicated he will go long if needed to not interrupt either side. So expect they'll both get their closings done on Thursday. But then what's interesting in federal court is that the prosecutors get a rebuttal. So they basically get two closings, which is a huge advantage. They get the last word. And so I expect you'll see that rebuttal on Friday morning, at which point then the judge will instruct the jury on the law, and then they will get the case. So expect the jurors to get the case on sometime later in the day on Friday. How are the prosecutors feeling? Well, one thing I will say that has nothing to do with the charges really or the evidence, but I think the best thing that has happened for the prosecutors really in the past few weeks is there was one juror who was dismissed from the case. This was a juror that I will say, if I sat through jury selection, this was a juror I would have struck if I had my prosecutor hat on. Just because of the way he had answered certain questions about his criminal history. He seemed to be minimizing responsibility in ways that, may be accurate, but there's no way to know. And he had pled guilty to committing a misdemeanor several years, like 20 plus years ago. And just given the way that he had responded to certain questions, he would have been somebody I would have struck. I was pretty shocked they didn't strike him. And he was somebody who I observed in the courtroom as being particularly attentive when the defense was presenting their case, and not so much when the prosecutors are presenting their case. And look, you can never get inside a juror's mind. You don't necessarily know that that means anything, but that is something that, you look for body language, you look for indicators. And if the juror is furiously taking notes only when the defense is presenting and not necessarily when the prosecutors are, that can be at least a positive sign for the defense. That juror was struck not because anything that I just said, not anything having to do with what I just said, but because of the lack of candor in response to certain questions about where he was living. There were like 3 different versions, one that he gave at voir dire, one that he gave upon questioning initially to the court, and then another one when he was asked back for further questioning. And so given the inconsistencies in his story, there was a concern that he was trying to actually get seated on this jury, stay on this jury. And so he was struck. So again, if I'm on the prosecution team, that is a huge positive. And just to show how much the defense clearly was very interested in keeping this juror, they had 3 different defense attorneys making arguments at various times about why the judge should keep this juror on the jury, various different reasons why, but they clearly felt very strongly they wanted this juror to stay, and I can understand why. So, having nothing to do with the merits, jury selection, you can't necessarily win a case as a prosecutor on jury selection, but you sure can lose one on jury selection. And this was a juror that, could have potentially, I think, been that person who could hang a jury. You only need one. So that was if I'm the prosecutors, I'm feeling good with the jury that at least better than that I had been before.
Yeah. And Eric, and we can have Christy probably fill us on this in a little bit. There was an other juror that was in question for a time that the judge had kind of commented on. We never got the whole story because it's a juror that they're talking about. But moving on to this question, and we can circle back to that, from Jerry Michael, a longtime friend of the show. She's been here. I want to know why the defense would say they would take 2 weeks to present their case. They said that I think it would be like anywhere between 3 days and however many other days, but it was a lot more than no case at all to present their case. And now no witnesses. Were they faking out the prosecutors? What kind of gamesmanship is going on here with you criminal defense attorneys?
Plenty of gamesmanship, especially in a high profile, high stakes case like this. Sometimes bluffs are made. Sometimes there's some misdirection. All of that happens in a jury trial. And so that could be the reason. I think additionally, what the defense would say is that, hey, the prosecution has failed to meet their burden, that they have failed to present enough evidence. And that's really the critical question for the jury is did the prosecution come with it? Have they met that very high threshold in a criminal case? I think the defense could contend, no, they haven't. And so we don't have to present anything. The defense has no burden. And that being said, jurors are human beings, right? Like, for example, if think about a parent, and let's say there were some cookies missing from the cookie jar, and there were 2 kids. Usually, you'd want to hear from both kids. You want to hear the counter narrative. You want to hear the other reasons. But in a courtroom, that's not how it works. And so I think that's played a role. And lastly, there's always a risk. There's a risk with putting on witnesses. What if you put a defense witness up there, someone from Bad Boy Entertainment or something, and that person says something incriminating or states something inartfully or misremembers something or comes off as suspicious, then you have done yourself a disservice. You shot yourself in the foot from a defense perspective. And so there's substantial risk when it comes to putting on any witnesses on the defense side. Perhaps the defense concluded that, hey, we don't need to take that risk because the prosecution hasn't come with it.
Yeah, and fattest to this comment, 4 hours. Wow, we're talking about the closings for each side. In state court, typically we see like an hour, hour and 15. 4 hours, a long time. The defense didn't even present a case. Are they going to present a 4-hour closing?
That's a marathon of a closing for anybody. But yes, I mean, what's happened is this case has gone on for weeks and weeks and weeks, and in a sense, the defense did put on a case. What I mean is through cross-examination, through entering in their own exhibits, example, the prosecution played some videos of the freak-offs, and defense said, whoa, 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 you guys left out this other part. This other part's important too. And so they were able to kind of get in what they wanted to get in through that process. And yeah, you better believe they're going to get up there and argue their hearts out, just as the prosecution is. So yeah, I think it's going to be a marathon of closing arguments.
Wow, I'm interested, and I'm going to get Christy's take on that. But Megan, to you, you're sort of the de facto psychologist here. So today there was kind of a light moment in court where he was asked, Sean Combs was asked if he's going to take the stand to testify in his own defense, and he said no. And at this point, he went on to say, "I'm doing great, Your Honor. I've been wanting to tell you, thank you. You're doing an excellent job," to the judge. At which point the judge actually laughed at this compliment, and then they moved on. But Megan, I mean, this just goes to show this guy is a guy that's been in front of a gazillion cameras, in front of fans on stages. He is a showman, and he can play to the court, and he's doing it to the judge, and the jury is seeing this. How does that play, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it plays in two ways. First of all, he does have superficial charm. And, we ascribe that sometimes to serious personality disorders, which I'm going to stay away from since I'm not diagnosing anyone. However, he is superficially charming and playful, but it will also come off as arrogant. And it depends on which way you're going to look at that and what kind of juror you are and what you're going to take away from that. Like, wow, he's super arrogant to say that. Someone else might say, oh, he's just human. He's a person. Oh, he's fun. I think it depends on what you're reading into him and what your view kind of is at the end of the trial. In what way do you view him and what way do you see him? But, I think that's a risk to take as well.
That's a great point. And Megan, just adding on to what Christy was saying, this juror, excuse me, who was struck, he was apparently saying he lived in one place, lived in another place, but then there was testimony about yet another not testimony, but conversations with the judge behind closed doors, I believe, about a potential juror. But the juror who was actually eliminated was an African-American man said to be in his early 40s and is reported to have been replaced by a middle-aged white accountant. And, I don't know that is going to be a Diddy's fan base, and not that matters, but as you heard Christy say, it takes one here. And
yeah,
I think that, potentially race here, even though it should not, could play a potential role in these, in people taking sides. I don't know. We've seen it happen before. But what are your thoughts about this African-American juror being replaced by a middle-aged white guy?
Sure. There's like a whole body of research too on jury dynamics and whatnot. But I can tell you, I think race and other similar demographics that make you more relatable to a defendant or make someone a juror more relatable will make them more sympathetic. So someone who is an other in every single which way, gender, race, profession, age, all of those things, I don't think will bode well. That being said, it could have zero impact whatsoever. A lot of these are extra legal characteristics that, are supported by research, but doesn't make it a guarantee.
Yeah. I hope it plays no part, but you just never know.
Yeah.
But Christy, to you, take us kind of inside baseball here. You were in this particular office, so now it's closing preparation time. What does the government, led by Maureen Comey, what are they doing after tomorrow is the charge conference to get the jury instructions straight. Are the closings basically done already? What are they working on over the next 48 hours, I guess?
I'd be surprised if they're all done because court just ended today. They've got to figure out what exhibits were admitted this morning before anything even happened, meaning before the jury came into the courtroom. The lawyers were still arguing about various exhibits, various text messages, whether or not they're admissible or not. So they, at this point, at the end of the day today, now finally know what they have in terms of admitted exhibits. Now, granted, I would say they're certainly not starting from scratch today. They have a working document that they are working on in terms of their closing, but it's up until even the last few minutes before you're going to actually head into court that day and give your closing statement, you are continuing to refine it and work on it. You're getting feedback not only from the other members of your team, but from supervisors, from higher ups. A lot of people, especially when you have a high profile trial, are really weighing in to make sure that you are marshaling the evidence in a way that is clear, that is convincing, and really compelling, that you are, we have seen in the last few days through agent testimony a lot of evidence about what was on the phones, messages between the two. And, some of it can be a bit dry when it's being read by lawyers or by agents. And so really during the closing argument, this is your time to pull all of this together and really talk about the human aspect of this. These aren't just messages. These are from the people that you've heard testimony from. Things like, when I would give, I did a sex trafficking trial at SDNY, actually prosecuted the first one at SDNY. And one of the things that I would try to do when I'd have documents is really talk about not just what the documents say, but what the witness told you about those documents, and not just what the witness said, but how the witness, how you heard the witness reacting, what you saw in real time. Jurors, don't you recall how hard it was for Cassie to tell you about this incident? And remember, she broke down at this point, and bring them back to the fact that they have been there for the past few weeks, and that they've been a part of this, and remind them, even though it's been several weeks since they've seen a number of these, alleged victims, that remind them not just of the testimony, but of what they saw, how they heard it, what the feelings were at the moment. That's going to be, I think, really whether or not this sings, whether or not the closing argument is compelling, is whether or not they are able to do that, able to really bring that humanity to it. And obviously the defense is looking to do the opposite. They are looking to say that what they, really build on what their theme was in the opening, that these were, women who are making their own choices, that these were, calculated choices for their own ends, and to sort of not get you to see them necessarily with the same kind of humanity as I think the prosecutors are going to be putting forward. So I think it'll be a really interesting battle of the lawyers. I'm anxious to see which lawyers from each side are going to be doing the closing arguments, because depending on which lawyers they are, the closing arguments may have a very different feel to them.
Yeah, and well, I assumed it was going to be Maureen Comey, but you would know better than me. But are they? Look at this question here from Jerry Michael again. Do you actually practice? Are they in a room practicing this closing at some point to each other?
I mean, I can't say what they're doing. I can say I always did. Always. And you're practicing because, again, something that you read on paper may sound great on paper, and then you start saying it and you're like, wow, this read really well, but I've got one sentence that goes on for line and line and line, and I'm stumbling over my words, and this isn't coming out the way as well as it may read. And so you are trying to figure out what your cadence is when speaking, and make sure that you're able to deliver it in a compelling way. So yes, at least that's what I always did. That's what prosecutors I used to work with would do. But, obviously can't speak to what's going on with the team at the moment.
Well, now I know why I got bounced out of so many stations. I never practiced my live shots. I would just make stuff up as I went. But crazy mom nurse here. What percentage of federal trials end in a hung jury? Well, their conviction rate apparently went up on the federal side to like 99% in 2024. So I would say very few, less than 1%, I would say, end up in hung juries. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Eric Faddis, to you, the defense moved for a Rule 29 acquittal today. There's always something in the defense pocket there. This time it's the old Rule 29 acquittal. What is this, Eric?
This is oftentimes largely meaningless. This is a procedural thing where the defense has to make a motion, essentially for a judgment of acquittal. And the basis for it is that, hey, the prosecution, even when the evidence is viewed in the light most favorable to them, giving them all reasonable inferences from the evidence. They still haven't met their burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt, and a reasonable juror could not find as such. And so, therefore, Judge, their case is such garbage. You got to throw it out now before it goes to the jury. And 99 times out of 100 or more, the judge says, whatever. I understand what you're saying, but I'm not going to steal this decision from the jury and dismiss it, especially in this case where there is certainly credible evidence on both sides. But one purpose of making it is in part to preserve grounds for appeal later if there is a conviction. These are routinely denied. No surprise it was denied here.
Yeah. It was as you heard Eric say, procedural. So when it's appealed, they can say that they took all potential or all possible routes to get this guy the best defense possible. Megan, to you, the defense, I think, just had about 23 minutes of reading a series of text messages into evidence, and they were mainly between Sean Combs and Cassie Ventura, who's the star witness here for the government. And one of the exchanges says, from Sean Combs to Cassie, "You think you can freak off without getting high? LOL." And she responds, "Yeah, I'll just have to be at my level and what is good for me." And what they're doing here goes on from here. They're trying to show, obviously, and they're trying to cloud this whole coercive control, the force, the fraud, the coercion, which is this part of the sex trafficking, to say, look, she was into this as well. She even went so far as to go and buy supplies for some of these things, as did the other victims. How difficult is this going to be for the jurors to now sort out, who are not PhDs like you, who are not trained necessarily in criminal behavior or psychology?
Right. I mean, there's one thing to be instructed and they will get clear instructions, but there's another thing to understand that this is kind of a new area for us, even in understanding domestic violence and why victims stay when we think, well, they had an opportunity to leave, or why they appear to be compliant because they're fearful. So I think that a lot of these charges, a lot of the dynamics and behavior are probably new to some of the jurors in this case. But and let me say, I think the defense did what they could do to chip away at this notion that these victims or alleged victims were necessarily forced or coerced. They played the hand they were dealt, and they were able to get in some evidence here that showed that they may have been willing participants, or let me say, would appear to be a willing participant. However, bit by bit and block by block, the prosecution kept presenting the evidence. And it's not just that they have evidence from one person. It's that they have evidence and testimony from multiple people who witnessed multiple parts that go along with the case and the allegations here. So I think in the beginning, there was kind of a question like, well, were they ever going to be able to really make this leap? But I think bit by bit, it wasn't such a leap after all. And I do think there is, for me, strong evidence that proves their case. But that being said, again, I think the defense did what they could do. And definitely they were able to chip away a little bit at the idea that perhaps some of these people weren't being forced.
Yeah. Fran Granger here. Jury has seen things we have not, including video of the freak-offs, which we'll talk about. I pray their verdict is just. And I'm sure once you see that, you can't unsee that. Christy, today as well, right before lunch, there are defense exhibits that are admitted into evidence showing the victim, Jane, who went under the pseudonym Jane, toggling between what they're describing as sex and parenting. In one text, she's talking about sex acts, and then in the next breath is talking about school shopping, calling it, quote unquote, mommy mode in her words. The defense basically trying to show, look, she was leading a normal life. She was having a sex life. She was having a relationship with her child. She was doing the school shopping. Of course, the government's going to say this is, part of the trauma that she was inflicted, and life went on despite the abuses that she was dealt. So similar question. And then I have another question for you, but I mean, how are the jurors will there be something in closings to sort of inform the jurors again, like the psychologist did in testimony, to say, even though they came back for more and they texted these things, it was still part of this coercive relationship? Do they have to underscore that 1,000 times in closings?
Yes. And I expect that they will be citing a lot to Dr. Hughes, who was their expert witness to talk about what coercion more broadly looks like. Now, Dr. Hughes didn't speak to any of the particulars facts of this case, but she spoke more broadly about what coercion can look like. And jurors can use that to the extent that they are not familiar with these kinds of situations and what coercion can look like, and apply it to the facts that they've seen. I will say that my view is that, the force, fraud, and coercion piece, maybe not so much the fraud, I think it was really more force and coercion with Cassie. There were a lot of incidents with respect to Cassie, a lot of incidents of force, all different kinds of coercion just being a threat of serious harm. You had threats that, not just that she wouldn't do well in her music career, but that she would be done in the industry. She wouldn't have a career. She would have no ability to make money and have a livelihood, that he would stop that. The threats against her parents, that her parents' jobs would be taken from them. I mean, there were threats of physical violence. It was it was a very compelling case, I felt, with respect to Cassie on the force. There were just so many incidents, even where, the defense that's tried to say, well, this is just domestic violence and that is separate and apart from the freak offs. But then you had incidents where, we all saw in video, she is being dragged by the hair when she tries to leave a freak off. When you ask the question, well, why didn't you leave? Like, we saw what happened when she tried to leave. He beat her and he dragged her by the hair to bring her back. So I really think, the one jury instruction that will be key here is that you don't have to find that the entire time that they were in a relationship, that with every freak off, that she was doing it against her will. Let's say they found some of those messages compelling, that at some point in the relationship, perhaps in the beginning, she was interested in doing these, and then things changed with the violence, with the threats. She no longer wanted to do this. Even if you just found one incident where the jury finds there was force or coercion to cause her to engage in those freak offs, one incident is enough to convict him. So I think that's something that if I were the prosecutors, I'd be really focused on, and making sure that the jury understood that, because I can think of numerous incidents, isolated incidents with respect to Cassie, that were quite clear to me where I felt the prosecutors had met their burden. As to Jane, I thought, it's a little tougher. She testified there really wasn't force in the duration of their relationship. She testified to one incident about a year ago where there was force, but it was an incident also where she started the violence because she had been jealous about thinking he had been on a trip with somebody else and he wasn't. And it's a violent, awful incident in connection with which she then, right afterwards, he told her to engage in this freak off. And so I think there is something for the prosecutors there, but it is a little messy. It's a little complicated. The coercion piece with respect to Jane, the threat that he would stop paying her rent, that's a tough one. I'm not sure that at least on its face, threatening for him to break up with her and not pay her rent, I'm not sure that's a threat of physical harm that would constitute coercion. He's allowed to break up with her if they're not compatible anymore in the relationship. She's not doing things that please him. He's allowed to break up with her, and he doesn't have to also pay her rent. Like, that to me is very different from the threat of financial harm with Cassie, where he's like, I'm going to end your ability to have a career in this industry. Or it's different than other sex trafficking cases I've had, where you have like this kind of debt or indentured servitude that victims feel like they have to, continue to engage in prostitution to get out of the debt. Like, that's where I've seen the coercion. This piece with Jane, it felt different. And there was a lot of testimony that came out that the defense elicited about, yeah, I guess, like, I think she was asked the question, would you give back the house if it meant you didn't have to suffer, doing these freak offs? And she was like, I don't think I can answer the question. She's like, I'm not sure. That's a difficult question for me. I don't know how to really answer that.
Yeah.
Like, yikes. That's not a good moment for the prosecutor. So I think her case will be a little more complicated.
Yeah. But to your point, it takes, like with jurors, it takes one incident, you were saying, for a conviction. So I think that is incredibly important for the government to obviously get that in there. We haven't even gotten to RICO, which is a whole other thing. But Eric Battis, to you. So we talked about the government closings, and for those just joining, over 4 hours is allotted for each side here. And without delivering any witnesses, you heard Battis say that they're going to have a robust closing. So, Eric, how do you approach this? I mean, this is week 7, day 28 of testimony. So is there someone who is literally creating like a closings notebook along the way, saying, okay, this is good, we need this, this is good, we need this? And how are you putting it together? What is the main point you want to hammer home?
Yeah, in my cases, absolutely. As you're going through trial, you're taking notes of the highlights for your side. You're like, hey, I don't want to forget that because it's really important. I need to remind the jury of this. And that's the thing too, is the jury has received weeks and weeks of evidence. Sometimes they forget, sometimes things get conflated, there's confusion. And so you absolutely have to crystallize what is most critical for your side. In my approach, I'm thinking about structure, I'm thinking about fluidity, I'm thinking about a narrative, I'm thinking about telling a story, and I'm thinking also about, reaching into the chest cavities of these jurors to get them to feel me too. Prosecution's got to do that. Defense has got to do that as well. And so, broadly, I think when it comes to the RICO charge, I think that the defense is going to draw separation between Bad Boy Entertainment and Diddy. Diddy might have done some shady stuff in his personal life, what have you, but that doesn't necessarily implicate this criminal enterprise with a bunch of affiliates who are criminals from whom we didn't really hear. When it comes to the sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, I think you highlight from the defense side all of the instances of consensual conduct. And that came out in the text message with Cassie, in the text message with Jane. There was undoubtedly some consensual romantic activities. Now, how far did that go? That did that pervade every single romantic encounter? That's a question for the jury. And then lastly, with the transporting people across state lines for the purpose of prostitution, there was a recent text, I think it was a text message from one of the businesses who provides this kind of thing that says, hey, Diddy was paying for their time, not their erection or whatever. And so, if you're paying for somebody to come and hang out with you, that's not the same as paying for someone to come out and have sex. And so I think broadly,
now you sound like a defense attorney. Now you sound like it. By the way, that company, that business is called Cowboys and Angels, but go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, well, that sounds like the Wild West. I don't know, but at any rate, I think that you have to highlight on those main points, and you've got to make them feel you too. And there's also, lastly, kind of a broad scare tactic is the wrong word, but emphasizing that, hey, we don't want the government in our bedrooms, and jury, you need to be thinking about that back there. You can't put the jury in the defendant's seat. You can't say that this case is going to affect you personally, Mr. or Mrs. Juror, but you can highlight societal issues that have been implicated in the trial.
This is fascinating. Megan, to you, Gulf Coast girl. I was going to ask you something else, which I still will, but there's so much evidence. I hope the important that's not what I was going to ask. Hold on. This is the one right here. Sorry, Gulf Coast girl. Franny Dunbar Breen. I think he may walk because YouTube lawyers are saying it's not a strong case. What's going on in the world now? I'm not going to mention the other case that we just got a verdict in, that the YouTube lawyers were all over. But this one, I haven't seen quite the, I don't know, kind of the vocal majority, minority, whatever you want to call it. But how is this landscape changing? I feel like it is changing some of the ways these cases are eventually decided. Are these law tubers now starting to have a real impact?
Oh, that's not a question for me. I have to tell you, you got to bounce that one off the lawyers in the room. That remains to be seen on me. You can ask me about how the criminologists maybe are impacting the world.
Well, Christy, what do you think? I mean, do you think that things are? I'll pivot for you, Megan. Do you think that these law tubers are starting to have some sort of influence over jury pools and tainting juries potentially?
Is that for me?
Oh no, I was going to ask Christy that.
Yes. Okay, go ahead.
I mean, not if the jurors are following the instructions as they should. They're not supposed to be on YouTube. They're not supposed to look at any media related to the case. I mean, that's a clear instruction that they've gotten from the judge day one, just even during jury selection, before they even got selected to the jury. They were told, don't read anything, don't talk about the case. They're not supposed to be deliberating or speaking about it with one another, with anyone else. So, I mean, if the system is working as it should and everybody is doing what they were told, then no one in the media, whether they're on YouTube or any other platform, should be having any influence over this jury. Now, the one thing I will say is almost all of these jurors during jury selection said that they had seen the video on CNN of, the video that they've now seen many, many times over in all different sort of vantage points and different clips. And so they had seen that before. Each of them were asked about it, and they all said that that would not affect their judgment and that they could look at the evidence as a whole, hear the arguments from both sides, and be fair and impartial. And so, taking the jurors at their word that is in fact the case, then hopefully that video, just the fact that they had seen that in the news, should not taint the jury pool going forward. That said, I am sure that is an argument on appeal that you are going to hear, assuming that there is a conviction, that is an argument that the defense would make on appeal, that, hey, this was so widely publicized, there was no possible way my client could have gotten a fair trial. But again, having sat through jury selection, having seen how meticulous the judge was in asking all of the questions about whether they could be fair and impartial, I think the judge, did a really, really outstanding job in trying to make sure that you had jurors here who could hear the case and didn't have a strong opinion one way or another.
Yeah, and Christy, here from Jackie, can they ask for readbacks in federal court?
Yes.
There you go.
Absolutely.
If true, if convicted, Diddy will only serve 15 years. It depends on the counts, right, Christy?
Yeah. So it's up to the judge what the sentence will be. The only parameters are if he is convicted of sex trafficking of either Cassie or Jane, that count carries a 15-year mandatory minimum in prison. So the judge would not be able to sentence him to less than 15 years if he's convicted of either of those counts. If he's convicted of other counts, like, for example, the transportation across foreign or state lines for the purpose of prostitution, there's no mandatory minimum there. So the judge has a lot of discretion. There are sentencing guidelines that the judges look at to give them a sense of what, given this offense conduct, given the defendant's history, kind of what sentence may be fair, but it would be at the judge's discretion as to how to proceed on that count. So that is a count that, in my opinion, the transportation for prostitution count, I think he's cooked on those counts. But those are the counts that are the least serious. They are the counts that don't have a mandatory minimum, likely wouldn't carry a very lengthy prison sentence. So those, that argument that was referenced earlier about, we paid these escorts for their time and experience, but not for sex. I just think that's laughable given all of the evidence that we've seen. They weren't coming there to admire his baby oil collection. And there was evidence actually from one of the escorts, if we didn't actually have sex, if I couldn't perform, I didn't get paid. I think the jury, this is a New York jury that has common sense. I think that one they will see through. I don't think that's much of a defense. I was surprised actually that the defense did not argue in the opening. What I thought was the better defense to that is Diddy's not the one knowingly making the arrangements for travel. He kind of didn't really know where people were coming from, what they were doing. Again, I think there's evidence that refutes that. There's evidence of him saying, let's let's fly in Dave, let's fly in them. So again, I think the evidence is pretty strong on this, but I think that's the better defense, not like, oh, we didn't, that's not why we're calling these escorts here. I mean, that, like, if there's one thing any of the jurors came away from this trial with, it's the fact that, like, Diddy seemed to be pretty obsessed with these freak offs. It was something that was really consuming his life. I mean, days on end, week after week, years on end that he was engaged in this. Like, he cared deeply about it. Like, yeah, that he wasn't playing around. There was a show that was supposed to be put on for him, and he took that very seriously. If one escort didn't work, you bring in the next one. Like, this is what I expect to happen. So,
and can the judge to Wesley John Holmes and Ozzy living in Tokyo, can they run concurrently or consecutively? How does that work? Can the judge stack the charges
on the sex trafficking counts?
Yeah, if there's more than one, if he's guilty on more than one count of whatever, can he say 15? Yeah.
My recollection, I don't want to say the wrong thing. My recollection, I believe they can run concurrently, but feel free to correct me on that. I'd honestly have to look it up and confirm that. I don't think those get stacked, where they would have to be consecutive. I believe they're concurrent, but please, if anybody knows anything different,
Look,
kind of keep me honest.
This is it's all about stumping the Harvard Law grad. You can't stump Faddis. And I know Faddis didn't go to Harvard Law unless he didn't tell me something. But the guy is Faddis. Who's better in the courtroom, you or your wife? Who's got a better courtroom presence there in the
I've done more trials, but her presence is undeniable anyway, and so I would have to give that to her.
Oh, there you go. Good answer.
Oh, that was a good answer.
Yeah. Megan, there was a comment earlier on, and I have thought about this. This is a guy who has literally had fixers out there to take care of problems, a la Ray Donovan. You're sitting on this jury and you're thinking there's a good amount of evidence, but this guy's going to know who I am somehow. And I don't live that far away. Is there a fear factor involved with this jury and this defendant?
It's funny you say that because historically, when RICO counts were used, it was used against organized crime in the traditional way we think about mafia, Sopranos and other crime families, I should say. So I think historically there has been kind of a fear associated, certainly intimidation of jurors in the past. In this case, it's a fine question. I'm sure at some level in some of the jurors' minds, there is that fear. My name is out there. He has done horrible things to people. If you believe the allegations, he's a powerful guy. What if he steps away from this? So I wouldn't be surprised if there is some fear or anxiety among some of the jurors. Certainly. Do I think it's maybe as deep-seated as the fear that was associated with traditional, I'd say, organized families? I couldn't say to that extent. But I would certainly say, I mean, look, regardless, this is a person who has a lot of power. And I am sure there is some anxiety among some of the jurors.
I mean, I know I would have it for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you could probably help that part.
Yeah. It's a scary thought. Christy, back to you. As a recovering broadcast journalist and now doing this and an author of a book, I look at things kind of like a narrative. I'm telling a story, and that is what lawyers, I think, are trained to do, to be storytellers in the courtroom. With this case with the government, it was not on camera. I was there for the first week, but you're just reading accounts, but it never felt like I was being told a story. It felt like I was being told different bits and pieces of information. This happened here, that happened over there, this happened over here. There are 3 AR-15s with their serial numbers scratched off, but it was never like never like a real cohesive story. Is that something that one should be concerned about if they are looking for a conviction here? Is that something the government is concerned about, or is it just the evidence that was presented is enough?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies from witnesses. I think where you have a paralegal from the U.S. Attorney's Office reading text messages, message after message after message, that can certainly not feel like you're getting a narrative or a story, right? This is somebody just kind of reading various documents out loud, and that can be dry, that can be boring, that can be boring for the jury. The reason that the prosecutors are doing it is because they want those messages in so that they can use them in their closing arguments. And again, if they're doing it well, they're using those messages to corroborate the witnesses who are telling the story. If you come out of the closing and you don't feel like you have gotten the full story of what happened to these women, then the prosecutors they're not going to win. Like they need to be able to really, tie up that narrative and use the documents, use that wisely in a way that is not taking over. I think that is one thing that unfortunately can happen, where you have so many exhibits, you have so many documents. I mean, you're doing a 4-hour closing. Okay, you can't lose the story. The story is key. You need to have the testimony from these victims front and center. And to the extent that there are messages and there are videos and there are other things that you can use to corroborate and say, here's how you know she told you the truth when she told you this, because you saw it in the text message, because you heard from this other witness who told you the same thing, because you saw this video, and you use it, to again bolster the credibility of the witnesses that you put on the stand. If they lose the story, they lose the jury. So that has got to be key. And I think that there can be in some of the examinations that took days and days and days, there was a lot of detail. And there were times where, the temperature of the room, where everything was placed. I mean, there was so much detail that sometimes I felt we were losing. What are the main things that matter here? The main things that matter is, there's no dispute that there were freak-offs. Both sides agree there were freak-offs. There's no dispute that there was domestic violence. We both know, both sides agree that there was. What is in dispute here is the circumstances under which these freak-offs happened. Why did these women find themselves in those rooms? Is because they wanted to be there, or is they felt they didn't have a choice? And so really coming back to that key point of, were they forced? Were they coerced? Were they defrauded to be there? Keeping that top of mind and keep kind of coming back to that, at least when you're telling the sex trafficking story, I think is incredibly important for the prosecutors to do. Again, I expect they will be able to do that in a closing, and hopefully in a 4-hour time frame. Don't get bogged down in the details. Keep the focus on the storytelling.
I agree with you 1,000%. I think one of the things happening here is also psychological, because we hear as viewers or watchers, trial watchers, that the federal government 99% conviction rate, and they're just going to come in here and destroy Sean Diddy Combs and Eric Faddis. I don't know that it felt that way. It felt a little bit up and down. Now, again, we're not in the courtroom every day watching this. When we get to Brian Koberger, there will be a stream, but here, federal court, no cameras. To you, as if you're his defense team, what is your biggest concern on the eve of deliberations, which is, I know, 2 eves away because it's Thursday, but what are you most worried about?
Certainly a number of concerns. It's incredibly high stakes. He's looking at up to the rest of his life in prison. You got to go to that state and bring it. In terms of evidence that can be an issue for the defense, one thing that came up with Cassie and with Jane is that there were allegedly Diddy making threats to release these videos. And so that's really, you want to talk about a hard concrete piece of coercion. If there was some sort of arrangement whereby Diddy wanted them to keep engaging in these sex acts and held over their head the specter that, hey, I could ruin your entire life in front of on a world stage. So you're going to do what I say. I think that threat is one of the most salient, especially because it's tied directly to the alleged sex trafficking. The other things when we're talking about physical abuse and that kind of thing, I think defense can argue, hey, DV was separate and apart from these romantic encounters. Whether it was or not is up to the jury, but defense can argue that. But when it comes to the threat to really ruin these women through embarrassment, through public condemnation, through releasing these very private, graphic sex acts on video to the world, I think that is one of the strongest arguments of sex trafficking by coercion, and one of the ones that's most easily tied into these sex acts that took place. Whereas, one could argue the DV is a little more attenuated. Some of the other threats and things like that are a little more attenuated. That one's tied directly to it, and I think that one's a problem.
Yeah. Someone just asked, there is no rebuttal witness because the defense rested, and the government had a chance to bring a rebuttal case, but they did not either. So it's going to go into the hands of the jurors after closing arguments. Megan, what do we know? There have been high-profile celebrity trials recently. This is another one. Is there any, from your vantage point as an academic, is there anything that we've learned about celebrity trials? Is there more empathy, less empathy? What do you think the jury, how are they feeling at this point towards this particular defendant?
Well, we know there's more interest in celebrity trials for a lot of reasons. And as someone who also teaches about media and crime, unfortunately, these celebrated trials, these small 1% of all trials that we see, will influence the way many Americans, a majority of Americans, feel about the criminal justice system, which is hard for me to accept. Even in my own classes, I have to, enlighten students that the trial really isn't the hallmark of justice anymore in our country. The plea bargain is, and that's the way most cases are resolved. But what we've learned from these cases, it's different depending on the case, right? Sometimes we learn that money can buy you justice. Sometimes we learn that no matter how much money you have, you're not above the law. Every case will teach us something different. So for example, like with the Casey Anthony case years ago, I remember people calling me like, how could this have happened? Your criminal justice system is shot. Everyone's getting away with murder. And, with the OJ case, that will happen as well. Whereas what we just saw with the Karen Reed case, I think there's a different feeling. People are going, wow, someone who was probably, or a lot of people thought she was truly innocent, prevailed. So, just because law enforcement or the odds were stacked against her, it doesn't mean that the justice system can topple you. So I think that we probably take something different away from every single trial or a major trial like this about what the justice system means. In this case, I'm very curious to see what the outcome is. I personally think the outcome will be that he is convicted on multiple counts, but not straight across the board. And I wonder if it will be, in the end, that Americans perceive it as a system of where justice worked. But I would be curious as well.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there'll be lessons. There'll be lessons.
There's always lessons. So Christy, to you, the word we haven't really talked about much tonight, which is really at the centerpiece of this case, is RICO. The RICO charges, which are the racketeering charges. Again, they have AR-15 rifles with the serial number scratched off. I thought that in and of itself is a federal crime, like nothing beyond that. So do you feel that the RICO charges here have been proved, and why or why not?
Yeah, so I think there's a tendency to think that proving the RICO is a lot harder than it actually is. Yeah. That people think, as Megan was saying about mobsters, and well, he's not a mobster. He's got his company, and like, how could this be racketeering? This is not what we're used to seeing with a racketeering conspiracy. And really, it's just, did he have people that he was working with who agreed to have this, common purpose, to engage in various criminal activities for the purpose of the enterprise being Sean Combs, and, was his business being used to further those criminal activities? And you only need 2 racketeering offenses that qualify under the statute as racketeering offenses. Only need 2 that go towards, proving up that conspiracy. And so I thought, I mean, the defense, and they argued this today in their Rule 29. Well, this is all personal. He's got a personal assistant who testified, this week, and he said he did all of this because it wasn't a big part of his job. And he would set up the hotel rooms. Yeah, he would bring the supplies. But, he was doing that because he was a friend and he was a nice guy. He wasn't doing that because it was his job. And then you get that on cross, and then on redirect, like, did you do this because you were being paid to do it because you were his personal assistant? Like, yeah, of course this was his personal life. You're a personal assistant, but you're being paid by him. It's not, you're doing this as out of the goodness of your heart because you're his pal. Like, you are an employee. His security guards were his employees. They were his fixers. His personal assistants were engaged in getting drugs for him, setting up the escorts, working on travel, like all of these things to make the transportation across state lines for prostitution happen. All of the things to the point of, one where, they would have these drugs where you have numerous assistants saying, yeah, we would bring him the drugs. We would travel with the drugs for him. All those things are criminal. And so if you're being paid to do it, and it's, you're using, there were multiple times where you're using the corporate credit card to pay for those expenses. It's hard to me to see how there's this bright line that I think the defense is really trying to draw between the personal and the business. And, there was a lot of bleeding, I think of those lines here. And I think the prosecutors have plenty of evidence, both from the witnesses and from the documents, to be able to show that, to show the money trail, show all the business expenses that were being used to further these crimes. And I think they've got certainly more than 2. I mean, like I said, I think he's cooked on transportation for prostitution, but that's 2 right there. So even if you thought he didn't do anything else other than bring in escorts across state lines for the freak-offs, like, that's 2. But there's arson with the Kid Cudi situation. There's the drug trafficking. I mean, there's a lot here. Even if you're not there on the sex trafficking counts, there was plenty of other, I think, less serious offenses that there's ample evidence that would satisfy RICO. So again, I think it all depends on how this is presented to the jury. But if the prosecutors present is like, this isn't as hard as you may think, and here's what we need to show, and here's how we've shown it, I would think they'd be able to get there, even if they have misgivings about some of the sex trafficking, which is the most serious conduct, because again, that's what carries the mandatory minimum.
Okay, sex trafficking, not the RICO. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, so sex trafficking can be one of the 2 offenses for RICO. And so if they find for the 2 offenses that one of those or both of those are sex trafficking of Cassie and Jane, if they find those counts for RICO, then yes, that count can then carry the 15-year mandatory minimum as well.
It's crazy. I've told you this before, Christy, probably, I don't know, 20 attorneys during if not 30, and I still have no idea what the RICO charges really, like how you really prove those RICO charges. But that's a whole other story. That's why I probably would have failed out a lot. It's not much I could have done in life. That's why I became a TV reporter. Just got up there and talk. Eric Faddis, they had this Homeland Security agent. We're going to wrap in a little bit. I just have a couple more points I want to get answers to, but they had this guy, Agent Joseph Cerciello. He really kind of tied all the loose ends, and someone was asking about an accountant earlier, but this guy was sort of monotonous but important, to Christy's point, because he tied a lot of things together. They talk also about a NDA that was signed, and it was presented by Jane to one of the escorts, and the defense made it seem here like this was like she was she was an organizer of this event, getting the NDA, not to protect herself or protect Diddy necessarily. To me, it's like counterintuitive. To me, this plays into the whole RICO charge thing, that this is this big I had to sign an NDA for Fox. I don't want to call Fox a criminal enterprise, but they are a former employer, and I want you to protect
Some
me,
might.
Titus. But yeah, some might. But my point is, the NDA to me speaks to more of a RICO indictment than not. How does it read to you, having people sign NDAs?
Their interpretation that there's information that some folks don't want to get out to the public. Is that because it's incriminating? Is that because it's problematic? Perhaps. Alternatively, I think the defense is going to say, you want to talk about a willing participant. She is engaging in these transactions with other participants to, have them sign NDAs. From defense perspective, they're going to say, "Hey, no one had a gun to her head. She was willing to do this." And in fact, there are text messages where Jane and Cassie both say they're willing to do this, and at least in some of the instances. And so I agree with Christy that the government is really going to have to draw a distinction between the undisputably consensual sex acts and what might not have been. Because a person can be with another person over the course of time, multiple times, and if 9 of those are consensual but one is not, then that's a crime. And I think the government really has to show the jury that, hey, it's not just this sort of cloud of consent that overshadowed the entire multi-year relationship. We've got to look at these specific instances. And so, I think the NDA can be interpreted multiple ways. But I think there's some shakiness on the RICO charge as well. You look at the serial numbers off of a firearm that was found at Diddy's house. What does that have to do with Bad Boy Entertainment? How is that connected back to the alleged criminal enterprise? If it's just a dude with a gun that doesn't have a serial number on it, that's not RICO. And I think there are a number of instances and pieces of evidence in the case that are hard to argue we're in furtherance of the criminal enterprise. Now, that's not exactly how the element reads, but that's how defense is probably going to argue it, is by saying, hey, we're throwing these cool consensual parties. That didn't somehow, put money in Bad Boy's pocket to make them sign more artists or whatever. And so I think that's probably how defense is going to try to confuse the issues at closing.
Yeah, these comments right here are interesting. Right on cue, COE. Do you have that one back up, the Christina one? This one says, do all the men not count for sex trafficking charges? Chrissy, that's a you question. What about the male escorts? A lot of people are confused about that. And then the comment that I wanted to bring up essentially could be any juror saying it was consensual. They were doing it because they wanted the money. And that was a woman saying that. So, there are going to be different takes from different people here.
Yeah. So as to the sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, there were 2 counts. One of them is as to Cassie, and one of them is as to Jane. So there is not a charge from the prosecutors that he forced any of the, or coerced or defrauded any of the escorts to engage in the freak-offs. That's not charged. Where the escorts come in is on those other sex counts, the transportation across state lines, because they were part of the group that was engaging in the traveling and engaging in the prostitution. Sorry, what was the other question about the consent? Yeah, look, I that's the key to this whole thing, is whether you think there was consent. I mean, like I said, I think it is more clear as to Cassie. Jane, I really question whether the jury will find sex trafficking as to Jane. There is a text message where she said, "I knew I was consenting." That's expect the defense over 4 hours to keep putting that up. She's asked about that on the stand, and she says, "I'm still trying to figure that out." Like, a lot of her testimony at times, was not as clear on those points. There were points of her testimony where she was extremely argumentative on cross. That she was arguing about Chanel bag and whether she's worth the Chanel and Bottega bag. Like, there were multiple moments where, and this was not an example of a defense attorney was really like being aggressive towards her at all. Tana Garagos was not. in her tone being aggressive, and actually was, I think, kind of treating her very respectfully. And there were moments where this witness was really fighting. And I can tell you from being in the overflow room for some of those moments, like there were collective, like, oh, wow, like audible reactions from people there as to how this witness was behaving. And I say that not to judge this witness in any way. I want to be very clear. I believe this witness has been traumatized, and people deal with trauma in all kinds of different ways. And so I am not saying this to in any way judge her behavior or even really question the credibility of what she is saying. I am simply making observations because it is entirely possible that a jury, a majority of men on this jury, you have 8 men and 4 women, that kind of, when any witness argues on the stand and does it multiple times and doesn't really, kind of evades answering a question clearly, like that makes it harder for jurors to necessarily get behind you if they're starting to then maybe empathize with the defense attorney. But I think that question of consent, she was talking a lot about material things, and even the fraud theory. I know I talked about force and coercion, but even the fraud theory, it's a little hard to understand. The idea was, as I understand it, of the prosecution's theory, is that Jane was defrauded because she expected more quality time to go along with the freak-offs, and she wasn't getting that, and she was upset. She was seeing these other women take trips, and she wanted the trips, and she wanted to go to Turks, and like if she had gotten that quality time, maybe it wouldn't have been so bad. And like that's not typically how I've seen sex trafficking cases charged, where there's a fraud theory. Where I've charged it, for example, it was women who they thought they were, entering into a romantic relationship with the man, and then he isolates them from their family and their friends, and then all of a sudden they're kind of forced into prostitution. And the fraud was they had no idea there was even going to be prostitution as part of the relationship. The fraud theory of, well, I thought there would be more of a balance of time where I got to spend time with him, and I got certain trips, and I got certain gifts, and I had a certain lifestyle. And that was less of the amount of time, and it was more of the freak-offs. Like, I think that is a difficult fraud theory to make. I think their best bet is on, again, the violence that happened in the very end, that one incident where he beat her pretty severely and then said, "You're not going to ruin my night," told her to take an ecstasy pill, and then they engaged in a freak off. That, to me, that one incident of force I thought was compelling. But there was a lot of other stuff there that I think, even for me as somebody who does this, was different than how I have seen sex trafficking charged. And so I question whether or not we will get a sex trafficking conviction as to Jane.
Interesting. And time is going to tell. Megan Sachs, Dr. Megan Sachs, is a PhD in criminology, teaches at Fairleigh Dickinson University, 2 podcasts, Women in Crime, Direct Appeal. Check it out. And look at this comment again from a woman. Megan, they chose to do this, went back and back, not sex trafficking. Are women jurors tougher on the women witnesses, I guess, in this case? In general, is that how it shakes out? And your final thoughts on how this all ends?
Yeah, it's funny. Sometimes you do find that women are going to be harsher because they tend to put themselves in that situation and think, well, if it was me, this is what I would have done, without really understanding the true dynamics of coercion and force and fear. So you do find that in some cases. And I would just want to say that I agree with Christy. I think there's a much clearer case as well of trafficking here, and one that's more questionable, which was why I stated that I don't think it's going to be across the board convictions. But I would be, I am obviously curious to see how this works out. And in the end, my question is, will he regret turning down a plea deal or not?
A woman is saying this, by the way. Women are the worst. Sorry, Beach Bum. I don't agree with that. But I just want to point out for the record.
Not always.
Faddis, I wanted to point, that's on the record, that a woman said that, not me. Eric Faddis is part of Varner Faddis Elite Law, the best legal Instagram account. What is the actual account name, Faddis?
It's at Varner Faddis. Yeah, check us out on Instagram, TikTok, all the things.
I
Yeah,
can't wait.
you're doing your thing there, Faddis. My whole question, isn't really posed to you, is that Diddy was partying 24/7. How'd the guy become a billionaire? That's really what I want to know. But Eric Faddis, these jurors watched these freak off videos. How do you think that affects these jurors, and your final thoughts on how this plays out?
The impact, the emotional impact of watching that cannot be understated. It's graphic, it's gripping. It's according to reports, some jurors were like taking off their headphones and frowning, and
The women looked
you know,
away and the men leaned in. That's what they said.
well,
I'm
don't know.
embarrassed to be a
But
guy, but go ahead.
one thing that I think on that piece that's interesting, that I'll be interested to see, is how much can you tell? How much can you glean from watching a video? Can you tell whether a person's consenting or not? I mean, you're going to look at their body language, you're going to look at their expressions, you're going to look at their mannerisms, perhaps their words. But how much can you really draw from that? And I think it'll be interesting to see how the jury interprets these videos. Does it appear that these people are consenting? Does it appear that they're hating what they're doing and they don't want to be there? I think all of those interpretations could be critical to either corroborating or disputing these allegations of non-consent. So I think that those videos could be key, and it'll depend on how the jurors see them.
Yeah, we are going to know probably sooner than later. Christy Greenberg, I met her in the overflow room, which sometimes felt like the overthrow room because people were getting thrown out of there. One day, someone even brought a baby in there. I don't know what these people are thinking. And the baby was crying hysterically. Not the baby's fault, but, things happen in New York City. But Christy, to you, 34 witnesses. We already forget this. I mean, this is a long trial. It was supposed to go to July 4th. It's ending probably a couple weeks before that. But 34 witnesses. Kid Cudi took the stand. His car is firebombed. Are we just losing ourselves in the moment right now because this is the last day of the trial? And will the government tie this up in a perfect little bow in closings on Thursday? And do jurors actually deliberate before the weekend?
I think the jurors will get the case on Friday. How much time they will have to deliberate, I can't imagine it's much time. I would be very surprised if the jury were able to return a verdict by the end of the day Friday. If they do, it's, most certainly that's positive for the prosecution. The quicker the deliberations tend to be in favor of the prosecutors, the longer it goes on, that's better for the defense. But I think they will at least be able to start deliberating on Friday. Will the prosecutors tie it up in a nice, neat little bow? I think I'm expecting a compelling presentation. Like I said, I'm very curious to see who is doing the closing and who is doing the rebuttal. I will say in my experience, the closing is really important, but the rebuttal is the last thing that the jury is going to hear. And it is, I think, the most fun, but also the most difficult thing to do, because you cannot, to your question about preparation, you can prepare some parts of the rebuttal. You can anticipate, okay, the defense is going to make this argument. If they argue this, here's what I will say in rebuttal. So you can have a lot of those modules kind of ready and prepared, but you have to be responding to things they are saying in the rebuttal. Like, you have to be listening actively, and you have to be writing things down and adjusting as the defense closing is going on. The prosecutor who's handling the rebuttal is writing and reorganizing and shifting the rebuttal. I mean, that is what a good prosecutor does. So that is a very tough skill. I will be curious. We should be hearing from Maureen Comey question whether she does the closing or the rebuttal here. I mean, having seen her in action at this trial, I think has really been extraordinary. And so, whichever one she chooses, I think will be great. I don't know which other usually she wouldn't handle both. You'd see, one of the other members of the team handle the other one. I've seen less of those prosecutors handling jury addresses to know how they will be. But again, they've lived with this case for quite some time. It's a high profile case. They will get lots of feedback, and I'm sure it will be strong. For the defense on the closing, I am very interested to see who it is who does it. Brian Steele has been incredibly effective as a defense attorney in this case, but he is a pit bull. So if it's him giving the defense closing, expect it to be a real risk for them, because I think he's got that mode where he's going to go all in. And I mean, we saw the cross of Mia where it was a really hard hitting cross. So I don't know that he could kind of pull back. I think if it's him, he's going to go hard. And look, that could, all you need is one, right? Like, so that could be compelling. But my money is on Mark Agnifilo. Giving the closing, and he has a different style. He is much more I don't know, like a gentleman in court. He very much is kind of a sober statesman of sorts. So it would be a very different closing depending on if either of them gave it. And obviously there are other members of the team as well, but those are the two that come to mind.
Yeah. We're going to find out soon enough, I think. By the way, that replaced juror number 6. He was reported, and again, this is not on camera, so we don't know for sure. We never see the jurors anyway. Reported to be a white male, about 57, but a lot of other people are saying, including Lauren Conlon, who's been in court, she believes he is of Indian American descent and not clear whether or not he's an accountant. So I just wanted to make that point.
Sorry, which juror? The juror who got struck?
The juror got struck was African American, but the alternate juror who replaced that juror was reported as a white male, but is now said to be an Indian American around 57 years old. So it would not be a white male in that case. So I don't know. I don't have that confirmed, but that's just wanted to put that out there for everybody. Faddis, I don't know if you've heard the buzz, but there is a new show. As you know, true crime can, and you too, Megan Sachs, you know this better than anybody. True crime can take a burden on people, a toll on people. It's heavy stuff, serious crime. So I came up with a brilliant idea to showcase my beloved mother's talents, Carm. And now on Fridays, we're doing a show called Leave a Comment. Leave a Comment. Maybe I should switch it to Leave Us a Comment. And Carm is a licensed therapist, and she's just answering questions. It could be about absolutely anything. I think I'm going to have to shift it to a different channel so YouTube doesn't get confused. But if you haven't checked it out, we'll have it for you this Friday. Of course, we're going to be on Verdict Watch for Diddy, but Leave a Comment, starring the one and only Carm, my mom, turning 86 years old. And if you have any issues, whether it's you're addicted to chocolate, you hate your husband, whatever it is, come on the show, and Carm will give you her wise advice, and that is invaluable. Maybe Diddy will call in from wherever he is for the show. We'll see that.
So.
Yeah,
I got some issues for Carm.
Okay, good. Bring him on, Faddis. Love you, America. Love you, Denver, Colorado, the Mile High City. Megan Sachs in where are you? You're not in New York or New Jersey, right? Pennsylvania, maybe.
Yeah, but you're still gonna think I'm from Jersey. It's okay.
I always think you're from that's my
know.
State. And Strong Island, New York, 100-something degrees, isn't it, Christy? It's hot out there.
It is really, really oppressively hot.
Here too. It's 100 here.
Come to Miami. That's why I live in Miami. It's hot all year round. There you go, from 20 to 100. So there you go. Run out of things to say. We'll see you all. Guys, stick around if you can for one split second, and we'll see you guys tomorrow night.